Good evening. This is Pastor Barbara, aka Preacher with Parrots. Today is the beginning of a new month, July 1st, 2015. It's Wednesday night. We have a live Bible study group, and we're recording the message part of that group. We ended last week with the defeat of the Moabites. We are both in, as far as the scripture that we're reading in 2 Kings and in the Chronicles. We've been in 2 Kings so long. 2 Chronicles 20, and 2 Kings 3. We ended with the defeat of the Moabites. The Moabites were frequently fighting with either Judah or Israel or both. Israel being the northern kingdom made up of 10 tribes, a group who's never had a king in their entire existence, never had a king that served God. And consequently, after a number of years, they were taken captive by the Assyrians and ceased to exist as far as those 10 tribes. Some people refer to them as the lost tribes of Israel. The 2 tribes of the southern kingdom, part of the time, their kings served God, and part of the time, their kings did not serve God. More often than not, they did not serve God. But we happen to be at a time when they did have somebody serving God, which was Jehoshaphat, a good king, and he followed Asa, who also served God. And then we had a couple of kings that began their reign by serving God, but they ended their reign by not serving him. We're going to go into, or continue, I should say, studying the northern kingdom, or the kingdom of Israel. Now, at this particular point in history, we have more interesting things happening in the northern kingdom than what we have interesting things happening in the southern kingdom. Perhaps that's because they had great prophets. So we just had the prophet Elijah, and while this is a chronological Bible, occasionally we'll be talking about the northern tribe, and it will appear that we've finished talking about that king. But when we begin reading somewhere else, we're still reading about him. So it's not totally chronological. Did it? Remind me later, will you, when I'm not recording? And I can take down the information for your prayer requests so that I'll be sure to get it out. And if any of you need me to have, I do have praises. I just haven't put it in my context. But if any of you need me to have your own contact for me and not through somebody else, be sure to let me know. All right, we're going to begin in Israel, the northern uh, kingdom made up of 10 tribes. And we're talking about the ministry of Elisha. We closed last Wednesday. And Elisha had kind of paid back some other youths. He was a youth himself in probably early 20s. And there were some, this refers to them as children, but those who have done the math, I didn't. Sometimes I will do the math if there is information to be had, just to make sure that it's absolutely truth, and I checked it out myself. I didn't, but I have no reason to disbelieve those who have, and believe that these were not really children, but youths, maybe teenagers, early, pretty close to Elisha's age. This is what happened to them. Now, this is the northern kingdom. The king is not serving God. The people are not serving God, but they've got prophets. And that's why we're getting so much information about them. And at this point in history, we're not getting a lot of information about the southern tribe. Now, there was a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets. The sons of the prophets was a group of prophets. It's a little difficult to explain exactly who they were and what they did. They were not prophets in that they did not work miracles as the prophets did, nor did they foretell, either in writing or in their speaking, about events that were going to happen in the future. And when we use the word prophecy or prophets, that's what we think of. But at this time in history, these sons of the prophets was a group in that hung out together, and they worshiped and praised God. And there was one occasion, you might remember, when Saul, not known to be a godly king, when Saul got among them, spent some time with them, and he was laid out all night, quote unquote, prophesying or uttering religious worship-like phrases. And there was even the saying, Saul among the prophets. So this is a group of men. And this had to do with a certain woman who was the wife. Therefore, she was in the group of the wives of the sons of the prophets. And there was a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elijah, saying, Thy servant, my husband, is dead. And thou knowest that thy servant, so now she's referring to herself, I did fear the Lord, or respect, or give the honor due the Lord that he deserves. And the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. When in those days you owed money, there were ways of paying your debt. Now we say, well, if I have no money, I can remember growing up hearing my dad use the phrase, you can't get blood out of a turnip because a turnip doesn't have blood. And if somebody doesn't have money, you can't get money out of them. But there are ways of getting, or there were ways that were used in those days of getting what was owed you. You could become a servant for however many years or your entire life, however long it took for a debt to be paid. So this man is dead, but he has 2 sons. And the person to whom he was indebted is now coming after the 2 sons to make them bondmen, or they would be his servants, his slaves, whatever word you're comfortable with. And the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. That's going to leave her with no support. You see how that works? Women did not inherit. Now, if her sons could grow up, if the father or his brothers or anything were to happen in the future and they were to get anything, or if they would work and get anything, she could be sustained through them. But if her 2 sons are off working to pay off their father's debt, here we have a woman with no means of support. This is something I've mentioned before when we've talked about having more than one wife. It was not unusual. There was an occasion in which King David went to battle against an enemy, killed the enemy, leaving the enemy's wife a widow. He then married the widow. David wasn't looking for another wife to love, but it wasn't unusual in those days for them to marry somebody, put them in, I don't want to say the harem or the hotel, but put them up wherever some of the other wives were, to give them a place to live. So she tells her story, and Elisha says, "What shall I do for you? Tell me. What hast thou in the house? Do you have anything of any value? What do you have? What's in your house besides you?" And she said, "Thy handmaid," or your servant, "I haven't got anything in the house. Well, I've got a pot of oil." 1 pot of oil. You know that oil and meal both were used in the tabernacle and in the temple. Both were necessary to make bread. We use similar things now for bread. Bread is what you eat when there's not a chicken you can catch to kill, when you don't have a chicken that's laid an egg. But if you have oil and meal, you can make bread, and that can get you by until you have a little bit more nutritious food. She said, "I have a pot of oil." That's it. Oil. Not even enough to make biscuits. Then he said, "Go, borrow thee vessels abroad, all of your neighbors, even empty vessels. Borrow not a few." Not a few means a whole bunch, because a few is just a couple. Not a few is much, much more than a couple. So he said, go everywhere you can and borrow a container, an empty container. "And when thou art come in, and you shut the door upon thee and thy 2 sons, you're going to pour out into all those vessels, and you're going to set aside that which is full." So she does this. Now she's got a bunch of empty vessels or empty pots. She's got one that has oil in it. You remember when Elijah asked the widow for bread, and the widow said, well, I have just enough to feed my son and I. We're going to eat our last meal. We're going to die. And Elijah said, feed me first. That seems kind of arrogant. However, she did that. She fed Elijah. She took the oil she had and the meal she had, and she made bread, and she fed Elijah. When Elijah got through eating, she went back, and the oil, the container that she'd emptied out, now was no longer empty. And the container that had the meal was no longer empty. So she was able to make that final meal for herself and for her son. But the container of meal and the container of oil were never really empty. Every time she went, there wasn't a lot, but there was what they needed for that day. I learned early, in my early 20s, as a young preacher. I never had my eyes on having a lot. All I wanted to do was make the house payment and the trailer payment, and this was before credit cards. And the first credit cards, if you weren't around by then, the first credit cards were gasoline credit cards, because if you had a credit card for gasoline, you were going to buy that brand. Credit cards were not in the name of any oil company. They were Gulf, or they were Mobil, or they were Standard. And so if you had a Standard credit card, you were probably going to buy Standard gasoline, and that's how credit cards started. So all I ever wanted was a car that wouldn't break down, a trailer I could make the payments for, and money to put gas to the next revival meeting. Too often, we want to go from having nothing to having everything. And I think the Lord would like us to learn that we need to rely on Him. Had either of us had a serious illness at that time, or had to have a bunch of, I think occasionally I had a tooth pulled. I don't believe Rose ever had a tooth pulled. She had very healthy teeth. Had we ever had a $500 or $1,000 debt, I don't know what would have happened. I remember our cat, Troubles, had babies in every district and every conference that we had. We heard about a vet on the border that only charged $15 to neuter a female cat. And we couldn't wait till we got to that part of Brownsville, Texas, to get her neutered for $15. We just didn't have money ahead. But we don't need money ahead. We only need what we need for today. Hi, Hopper and Inventor Jim. Is this the first time you've been on my program? I shouldn't start a conversation because I'm recording. And when I finish recording, then I'll get back and do my conversations with you all. But it's my fault for starting a conversation and not being able to keep it up. But as soon as I get through recording this message and we go just to the live program only, then we'll chat. So we don't really need, we like to have, it's comfortable to know that you have something in savings. It's comfortable to know that if you needed a couple $100, you could get your hands on it. But it's not what we really need. If this Elijah's widow would have said, no, I'm not going to cook for you, she had no way of knowing this miracle was going to happen. It was either you already ate your last meal, or what you're going to have now is your last meal. It wasn't all that much difference. Had she not fed Elijah first, then the oil and the meal would not have been there. But because she did, it was always there, whether food was needed for Elijah or for her and her son. So now we have the next generation prophet, Elisha. And Elisha is saying, take these empty containers, take the oil that you have in this and pour into those empty containers. And she went from him, shut the door upon her and her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, now she starts out with one container of oil and a bunch of empty vessels. Oh, it looks like I've just lost. Hang on. Something's wrong with my laptop. And I just lost my live class, so I've got to take a minute to see what's going on there. Well, I'm going to close the video and I'll be back to finish it. We're 21 minutes into it, and we'll be right back.